Hello, I'm Dr. Talia Charney, the Nutrition and Health Education Manager for PureSource, and today I'll be providing you with a training titled Diabetes Mellitus, a Functional Nutritional Approach. The prevalence of type 2 diabetes is unfortunately increasing worldwide, or has been for the past few decades. In Canada, you can see between 1998 and 2009, the diagnoses increased by 70%. Between 2008 and 2013, the statistics are no better. You're more likely to be hospitalized if you have diabetes with a number of diseases, 3 times more likely for cardiovascular disease, 12 times for end-stage renal disease, and 20 times for non-traumatic lower limb amputations. In other words, uncontrolled diabetes is a very dangerous condition. Insulin works hand in hand with glucose when you ingest a meal in order to get your blood sugar levels to go down and into your cells. Glucose enters the cells through a glucose channel. However, that requires that insulin bind to its own receptor, which helps to open up the glucose cells. Just keep that in mind as we go through, that glucose and insulin are, in a sense, partners in crime. It can take up to 10 years for somebody to be diagnosed with diabetes, during which time their blood sugars may be slowly rising but within the normal range, and their insulin too may be rising. Unfortunately, insulin is not measured at routine blood tests, so it wouldn't be known. But what happens during this time is that because blood sugar levels keep on spiking, insulin tries to manage this. So insulin levels keep spiking as well. But what happens over time is the body starts to pay less and less attention to insulin. It's sort of like the story of the boy who cried wolf. People kept coming and running to his rescue, but after a while they didn't pay attention. The same thing happens with insulin. After a while, the body doesn't pay attention, and so the pancreas needs to produce more and more insulin for the sugar to do the same thing, which is to lower the levels. Eventually, this process is ineffective, and that is where the blood sugar levels are no longer to remain within the normal range, and a diagnosis is made. However, you can be helpful to people during this period. They will often come to you and say things like, "I don't yet have to go on medications, but my doctor says I'm borderline." In other words, their blood sugars are sort of at the upper border of the normal levels. Advanced glycation end products occur in all of us. They are the result of sugars binding to proteins in the body. However, when somebody has diabetes, there are excessive amounts of advanced glycation end products, and the body cannot keep up with them, and they can cause some of the damage long term when we have poorly controlled diabetes, as well as some of the long-term side effects for other chronic diseases like heart and kidney disease or Alzheimer's. In order to conceptualize how they affect the body, think of a piece of toast. Actually, when we brown foods, we also produce these advanced glycation end products. So if you take a piece of soft bread and toast it, the reason that it becomes brittle and breakable is because of the increase in advanced glycation end products, or the production of them. Well, the same thing happens, for example, in your arteries. If there are excessive amounts of advanced glycation end products, then your arteries become kind of like toast, brittle and inflexible. The long-term risks of diabetes are many. It can cause stroke or increased risk ulcers, neuropathies, impotence, blindness, amputations, cardiovascular disease, and kidney failure. The risk factors for diabetes are many as well. Family history, being inactive, obesity, aging, impaired glucose metabolism, and one of those risk factors is metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is a constellation of symptoms consisting of high fasting glucose, increased blood pressure, low HDL cholesterol, sometimes referred to as good cholesterol, abdominal obesity, and high triglycerides. Triglycerides are a type of fat. If somebody has all of these symptoms, which are all defined, as you can see, with particular ranges, then they would be diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. Someone with metabolic syndrome is at higher risk for diabetes, and someone with metabolic syndrome can have diabetes at the same time. Recall I was talking about how insulin can creep up, and eventually the body doesn't respond, and I refer to this as insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is correlated with all types of diseases or illnesses. So you can see here, insulin resistance is of course associated with diabetes, but also with increased abdominal fat, high cholesterol, gout, chronic kidney disease, acne, sleep apnea, heart attacks, fatty liver, the list is long. There are a number of blood tests that are used to diagnose diabetes, from the more common one that you would be familiar with, a fasting blood glucose, to some that are perhaps less typical. As you can see in the second bullet point, one of the tests is a hemoglobin A1C. This would be a test routinely performed for those already diagnosed with diabetes. It is a more accurate test than simply a fasting blood glucose because it reflects your average blood sugar levels not only for one point in time, but for the past 3 to 4 months. And it is a reflection of the percentage of hemoglobin, which carries oxygen in the body, that is coated with sugar. In other words, glycated. Remember advanced glycation end products? In order to understand some of the natural treatments we can use for diabetes, it's helpful to understand what are considered some of the underlying processes going on when it comes to somebody who has diabetes. One of those is excessive amounts of oxidative stress. So we all have free radicals, and those are hopefully kept in check with antioxidants. And if not, we have excessive amounts of oxidative stress causing damage. And that occurs in diabetes. Lipid peroxidation is related. However, it's sort of oxidative stress and damage to our own lipids or fats, and particularly those that are surrounding the cells in our bodies, so our cell membranes, which are made up of fats. Microvascular dysfunction is common, so damage to the small vessels in the body. And of course, if small vessels are damaged, then blood flow is inhibited and the delivery of nutrients to all the cells in the body. Advanced glycation end products, I've already spoken about. Endothelial dysfunction is when there is a damage or dysfunction to the lining of the blood vessels, known as the endothelium, and that also occurs. The best way to treat diabetes is to have a holistic management and look at all aspects of somebody's life, including their activity levels, habits like smoking and alcohol consumption, their sleep quality, and so on. And one of the things we can do, of course, is to offer supplements. Diet is also a very important part of the management of diabetes, and it can be approached from many different angles. I won't be talking about all of them today, but next I will be talking about the glycemic index and glycemic load. Diabetics are often asked to follow a low glycemic index or low GI diet as a way of managing their blood sugars. The glycemic index, put simply, is just a measure of how much a food affects the rising of blood glucose after consuming it. So a diabetic would be told to follow, as I said, a low glycemic index diet. And generally speaking, this is a helpful way to manage their blood sugars. However, the glycemic index isn't perfect because it doesn't take into consideration a normal serving size, and it's also just a reflection of the sugar in the food, but it doesn't look at the whole picture of the quality of that food or that meal and how that affects blood sugar spiking. For example, if we just take a teaspoon of sugar in our hand and eat it, it will not have the same effect as if we take that same teaspoon of sugar and mix it with some protein and fats. These will change the rate at which it's released into our bodies and will not have the same ultimate effect, or if we combine that with fiber. So it's not perfect, and that is why you will find that some healthy food choices, such as carrots or watermelon, parsnips or bananas, will have a high glycemic index, but their glycemic load is actually not high. So the glycemic load is a more accurate but less common measurement of blood sugars, and it takes into consideration the quality of the food and what it's combined with. But we can't always measure the glycemic load because it doesn't exist for any particular meal that we put together. So most people rely on the glycemic index. It's just important to keep in mind that we don't need to avoid all kinds of healthy foods. Here's an example. The glycemic index for carrots is 71, which is high. However, the glycemic load of carrots, which takes into consideration, again, the entire food and all the fiber, is just 6, making it a healthy food choice when eating a standard serving size. So now I'm going to talk about a full range of supplements that might be used to help manage diabetes. I'm going to start with vitamins and minerals. Vitamin C is a supplement that may be helpful in diabetes. Firstly, it's an antioxidant, of course, and oxidative stress may contribute to diabetes. One study showed that taking vitamin C can improve chronic periodontitis in type 2 diabetes. Another study suggests that vitamin C may be low in diabetics as compared to the regular population. And lastly, and I find quite interesting, is that vitamin C and glucose actually compete with one another to get into our cells. They have the same transport mechanism. Imagine just one lifeboat and either vitamin C or glucose can fit into it to get into our cells. Diabetics have excessive amounts of glucose, so it makes sense that they may want to supplement with extra vitamin C. Vitamin E is another possibility for diabetes because, again, oxidative stress may contribute to type 2 diabetes, and vitamin E is an antioxidant. Vitamin E, according to some studies, may help reduce some of the diabetic complications such as cataracts, neuropathy, or cardiovascular disease. We know vitamin E aids in fatty acid metabolism. It may reduce insulin requirements, and like vitamin C, it tends to be low in diabetics. Notice as I go through the different points, I have referenced a PMID. That is a number you can use to search in PubMed to look up the particular studies that I am referring to. Vitamin D is another consideration. Studies suggest it improves insulin secretion and sensitivity, and it may reduce the incidence of type 1 diabetes. We also know that people with lower vitamin D levels have a significantly higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes compared to people with higher vitamin D levels. This is based on population studies. Study on vitamin K2, a double-blind study, showed that it may have a role in improving insulin sensitivity in overweight individuals who have insulin resistance. However, the doses used in this study, as you can see, are 30 milligrams, and the average supplement comes in units of micrograms, which are infinitely smaller. For example, you can see 100 micrograms is quite a typical dose. Therefore, although this study is interesting, I do recommend vitamin K2 for general use and for other uses, but perhaps not at this particular time for diabetes, at least not in those type of doses. Chromium may be helpful as an additional supplement in the management of diabetes. It's a vital component in blood sugar regulation. It's a cofactor for insulin. It's depleted by the excessive consumption of refined sugars and carbohydrates. And it may decrease fasting blood glucose, insulin levels, hemoglobin A1C, and increase insulin sensitivity. A systemic review and meta-analysis in 2014 suggests that overall it seems to have a positive effect based on all the studies on blood lipids and fasting blood glucose. A meta-analysis is a grouping of studies done to look at what do we know about that particular issue thus far. And when a meta-analysis is done, usually or hopefully there's a certain high standard for tests, and so we don't look at every study, but those studies that are considered to be of high enough quality, such as the randomized controlled trials. Vanadium is another possible consideration. It is a poorly understood mineral. It seems to have insulin-like activity. It may support glucose metabolism. We know it prevents zinc loss from the pancreas, and this may be a clue as to how it works or why it might be helpful. It is found in the liquid multi-gels, so a multivitamin Buy Now brand, and that multivitamin may be a better choice than some of the others because it contains chromium and vanadium, as well as alpha-lipoic acid, which brings me to the next supplement. Alpha-lipoic acid is probably one of my favorite supplements for diabetic neuropathy. It has a long history of use for this in Germany, at least 20 years. The dose ranges are typically 600 to 1800 milligrams a day. 5 randomized controlled trials concluded that it is both safe and effective for the use in diabetic neuropathy. Studies show it may reduce triglycerides in skeletal muscle and the pancreas. It might protect the pancreas beta cells from destruction, and those are the cells that produce insulin. And I've noted here another meta-analysis in 2017, more recently. Magnesium is something else to consider. A meta-analysis in 2017 says magnesium seems to produce favorable effects on fasting blood sugars, on what we call good and bad cholesterol, triglycerides, and systolic blood pressure. Overall, it seems to be something that might be helpful and reduce the risk of type 2 diabetes. As you can see in the little picture below, high blood glucose, which is of course something that's typically occurring when someone has diabetes, can cause excessive amounts of magnesium loss, and low magnesium may contribute to insulin resistance, and thus you might have a vicious cycle. Zinc is another consideration. Diabetics tend to excrete more zinc. Zinc is involved in the synthesis, storage, and release of insulin. It's concentrated in the pancreas, which suggests there is a need for it there, or a role. It seems to have insulin-like activity, and it may protect pancreatic cells. A study on type 1 and type 2 diabetics, in this case obese prepubescent children, showed that with the use of 20 milligrams of zinc, insulin levels were decreased significantly. A meta-analysis on zinc and diabetics also suggested that it seems to be something we could consider because of a modest reduction in glucose concentrations and a trend towards reduced hemoglobin A1C. It is not uncommon for somebody with diabetes to be put on a multi-B vitamin, probably because most of the B vitamins, in one way or another, are involved in just the normal metabolism of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, although there may be specific roles for different B vitamins. I'm not going to review each and every one of them, but I will point out a few highlights. For example, vitamin B3, otherwise known as niacin, has very strong evidence that it can decrease LDL, otherwise known as bad cholesterol, and increase HDL, or good cholesterol. And having blood lipids that are abnormal is quite common for those with diabetes. Vitamin B6 is known to have a role in glucose metabolism and may be helpful for retinopathy, one of the long-term side effects of poorly controlled diabetics, where you have damage to the retina of the eye. Folic acid is thought to be decreased with the long-term use of metformin, a very common prescription medication for diabetes. And B12 is commonly used to try to help with some of the side effects of neuropathy or nerve damage that may also occur with poorly controlled diabetes. So those are just some of the potential roles for B vitamins. Less commonly used for diabetes, but definitely worth mentioning, are some interesting amino acids, starting with L-carnitine. Now, Canapure is a particularly well-researched form and brand of L-carnitine, and it is made up of L-carnitine tartrate. L-carnitine is well known to be pivotal in the metabolism of fats, helping them cross the membrane into the mitochondria of the cells. It's also an antioxidant that's helpful to protect against lipid peroxidation. If you recall, I mentioned at the beginning, diabetic persons may have underlying excessive lipid peroxidation or damage to the fats and oxidative stress. In 2013, a meta-analysis was done for type 2 diabetes and L-carnitine, and overall it suggested that there is an association between the use of L-carnitine for diabetics and an improvement in their blood sugars and their plasma lipids. Another interesting amino acid to consider is carnosine or L-carnosine. We know that it controls blood sugars via the autonomic nervous system. Study on rats anyway suggests that it may be a glycation inhibitor, and that means it could reduce advanced glycation end products, which is a good thing. It might protect LDL, otherwise known as bad cholesterol, from oxidation and glycation, and it may even prevent protein cross-linking in the eye lens, which is something that leads to the development of cataracts, common for those with diabetes. It may prevent microscopic blood vessel damage and loss of sensory nerve function. Now, these are all studies on rats, so it remains to be seen what role L-carnosine will have in human beings. L-arginine is another amino acid one might consider. There was a study done on a population that I would say would be at risk for diabetes. So persons who had impaired glucose tolerance and metabolic syndrome. They took 6.4 grams a day for 18 months. The results were an increased regression towards normal glucose tolerance and improved insulin sensitivity and beta cell function. Be cautious when giving L-arginine to those with herpes simplex virus, as it can aggravate this condition. Coenzyme Q10 is something else to consider. Small studies suggest that it may lower blood pressure, but the studies right now are somewhat unreliable. In other words, more studies or better studies are needed. It may prevent oxidative damage in cardiovascular disease, one of the long-term side effects of poorly controlled diabetes, and it may improve glycemic control based on one controlled human trial using a dose of 100 milligrams twice a day. So I think there can definitely be an argument for the use of coenzyme Q10 when it is appropriate for other things, such as when somebody is on a statin drug and also happens to have diabetes. So let's talk about some herbs that may be helpful to manage blood sugar levels or deal with some of the side effects with poorly controlled diabetes or prediabetes. Let's talk about bilberry first. Some common uses for bilberry are diabetic retinopathy, so that's damage to the retina of the eye, night vision, and chronic venous insufficiency. I've gotten a lot of great feedback for bilberry when it comes to night vision, even though the studies to date are contradictory. Bilberry contains anthocyanins, great antioxidants, and anthocyanins can also help to dilate blood vessels, so they are vasodilator. A systemic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials suggests that bilberry may improve vascular health, which explains some of its common uses. Cinnamon bark, probably one of the most popular supplements for diabetics. So starting with in vitro studies, meaning outside of the body in a petri dish. One study suggests that the use of cinnamon can increase insulin-dependent glucose metabolism and seems to act as an insulin mimetic. And another, that cinnamon seems to offer significant antioxidant activity. And as you can see below, there's an explanation as to how cinnamon may work via the regulation of the expression of genes. A study on 60 men and women, aged average 52, with type 2 diabetes, used 3 different doses of cinnamon, 1, 3, and 6 grams, for 40 days, including a placebo group. And the results were that all doses reduced the average fasting glucose, triglycerides, LDL, and total cholesterol. So that seems quite positive. More importantly, a systemic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials done in 2013 found statistically significant results, for example, of decreased fasting glucose, total cholesterol, LDL, and an increase in HDL. Something I want to point out is that most of the studies used a particular type of cinnamon, which is the cassia variety. Why is this important? It's important because some companies, such as the Now brand here, will use cassia cinnamon variety, and that is again because most of the studies are based on it. But others may use what's sometimes referred to as true cinnamon, which comes from Sri Lanka. There are many different varieties of cinnamon. So why one or the other? Well, in a sense, it's important to base what we use on studies, and therefore it makes sense to use the cassia variety. The reason that some people shy away from it, or some companies may use a mixture, is because cinnamon contains a substance called coumarins, and in excessive amounts, coumarins can be toxic to the liver. However, that's only in excessive amounts. The cassia cinnamon by the Now brand, the coumarins are measured in it and are well within safe levels if taking the dose recommended. However, if using cinnamon in a sort of unmanaged way, so not in a sort of standardized extract, and just taking perhaps tablespoons of the powder as some people do, then I suggest to be on the safe side to use the true cinnamon. True cinnamon does contain the coumarins, but only on average about 0.04% coumarins, whereas the cassia variety on average contains 4% coumarins. Curcumin may prevent the onset of diabetes, so there could be an argument for its use according to a randomized controlled trial. This was a 9-month-long trial on a pre-diabetic population, and the results were that 16.4% of the placebo group was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, but none of those using the curcumin were. The common household spice fenugreek is another potential option to use in diabetes. A double-blind placebo study using just 1 gram of fenugreek extract daily, which would be the equivalent of 2 capsules of the now fenugreek, showed increases in insulin sensitivity, a decrease in insulin and glucose, increase in HDL, sometimes called good cholesterol, and a decrease in triglycerides. Excessive levels of triglycerides are associated with an increased risk of stroke and heart disease. Gymnema has a fairly long history of use in the treatment of diabetes traditionally, and studies seem to suggest that this makes sense. It improves glucose uptake into cells, and some studies suggest that it might even reduce the requirements for insulin, and perhaps do that by regenerating insulin-producing pancreatic beta cells. One of the more interesting things about Gymnema is if you empty a capsule onto your tongue, you will find that you cannot taste sugars for a period of time. This can be helpful for somebody who has sugar cravings with their meals, so instead of swallowing the pill, to empty it on their tongue. Ginkgo biloba is something that one might consider for diabetic retinopathy. A study was conducted using 120 milligrams of a standardized extract of ginkgo, such as you see here by the Now brand, for 6 months. And the population was for those with early diabetic retinopathy. Those who took the ginkgo experienced a tendency towards an improvement. The results were not significant, but there was a trend towards that. However, those who were taking the placebo experienced a worsening. Olive leaf extract is well known for a variety of uses. One may be to support the immune system, another for hypertension, and a third one in this case is the potential prevention of metabolic syndrome. One randomized controlled trial done on 46 overweight men showed that the results of olive leaf extract were comparable to metformin, a prescription medication commonly used for type 2 diabetes, but also given to those who are perhaps at risk of developing metabolic syndrome. The conclusions were that olive leaf imparted a significant improvement in insulin sensitivity and pancreatic beta cell secretory capacity in the population used. Quite positive. Soluble fiber is something else that you can consider for somebody who has high blood glucose levels. Generally speaking, soluble fibers are thought to reduce elevated blood glucose and reduce the glycemic index or the glycemic load of a meal when added to it. Of course, we know that soluble fibers slow down the transit time of food, which may explain in part why they're helpful for elevated blood glucose levels. And they also increase our satiety. We want to try on a daily basis to get 30 or more grams of fiber in a combination of soluble and insoluble. One good option for soluble fibers would be apple pectin. There are 3 studies you can see here that all suggest that apple pectin may be helpful when it comes to elevated blood glucose levels or even elevated insulin levels, and for the management of various blood lipids. Another consideration could be glucomannan. A meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials using glucomannan on those with diabetes showed that it is beneficial for, again, the management of blood lipids, fasting blood glucose, and the conclusion was it's helpful for type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, or just healthy people to balance blood sugar and manage blood lipid profiles. Spirulina may be a less common consideration. I like spirulina, just generally speaking, as a healthy food. It is a blue-green vegetable plankton. It's particularly high in beta-carotene and protein levels as compared to other greens. It's the highest known vegetable source of B12, and like all whole foods, it contains a variety of great nutrients, vitamins, minerals, trace elements, amino acids, enzymes, and also some essential fats. But what do the studies show? Here an example of 3 different studies on spirulina for type 2 diabetics. And all of them sort of indicate the same trend, a benefit when it comes to lipid metabolism in diabetes. And as you can see, the second study also indicated a significant reduction in hemoglobin A1C levels. Because spirulina is generally quite healthy and safe, I think it is a great addition. Inositol is a B-like vitamin, and studies show its effects seem to be comparable to insulin sensitizers. Its benefits seem to be particularly for a population of women who have polycystic ovarian syndrome. So there may be a good argument for its use for women who have PCOS and diabetes. Pycnogenol is another consideration. It is well known as an antioxidant in that capacity, as a scavenger of free radicals, but also as a helpful supplement for microcirculation in particular. As you will recall, one of the underlying issues when it comes to poorly controlled diabetes is poor microcirculation. There are many studies on pycnogenol, and they suggest it might be helpful to deal with a number of the side effects of diabetes, including diabetic retinopathy, chronic venous insufficiency, diabetic foot ulcers, and erectile dysfunction. Here I've provided a summary sheet for you so that when you have somebody who's coming into the health food store and looking for different options for diabetes or perhaps pre-diabetes, you can have some idea of why some supplements may be more useful in some situations over the other. So if you have somebody who has diabetes and cataracts or retinopathy issues with their eyes, then you might consider pycnogenol, ginkgo, bilberry, vitamin E, and L-carnosine. If you have somebody who has diabetes and dyslipidemia, so they say they have high cholesterol, then perhaps you'll consider L-carnitine, fenugreek, spirulina, and so on. Those that I list as general priority are just ones that may be more useful across the board for anybody with diabetes or pre-diabetes, either as a treatment or for prevention. For those who are using metformin, you might want to suggest to them that they should get their folic acid and B12 levels assessed and consider supplementing with those. Thank you for listening. I hope you found that helpful and that you're better able in future to deal with customers dealing with pre-diabetes, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, or any one of the long-term side effects or issues that develop out of poorly controlled blood sugar regulation.